Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this webinar. We will be discussing the new EU action plan against migrant smuggling and the role of politics and evidence. And therefore, today we have with us distinguished academics who have been looking in the issue on migrant smuggling, as well as key civil society organizations that have been working on the issue. And today we are speaking because the upcoming EU action plan against migrant smuggling, like its predecessor, is suggesting that fight against migrant smuggling will continue to be at the EU's response in fighting irregular migration. And here is the central question, whether it's criminal justice tool or mechanism, or it's aiming at to prevent migration. The plan defines migrant smugglers as ruthless criminals that are involved in polycriminality and other sort of crimes. However, the growing academic evidence is challenging these assumptions, and we'll be discussing with some of academics who have been behind this very impressive research. So, for instance, one of the key issues is that self-organized travels are on rise, so even without additional assistance. It's also important to speak with the civil society because they are on the ground and seeing how it impacts the lives of migrants, asylum seekers, and those who try to help them. And also what kind of unintended impacts the EU action plan on migrant smuggling has had in the past, and EU's legal framework, especially so-called EU facilitators package. So today with us we'll have Gabriela Sanchez, who is a research fellow at Migration Policy Center at European University Institute and Danish Institute for International Studies. Eugenia Kusumano, who is Marie Curie fellow at the University of Venice. Roxana De Masol de Rebes, who is PhD candidate at Leiden University, Leiden School of Law. Keira Arusha, postgraduate researcher at University of Leeds, and as a discussants we'll have Roberto Farin, who is Global Program Coordinator at Mixed Migration Center that is part of Danish Refugee Center, and Michelle Lavoie, who is Director of Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, otherwise known as PICOM. So we are very happy to have you on board. And this is indeed a very timely debate because Commission's public consultation on EU action plan against migrant smuggling is finishing this Friday. So we are kind of jumping in this passing train and trying to contribute and to bring our evidence forward so that civil society, but most importantly, European Commission colleagues at DG Home also could consider what researchers and civil society highlight in their evidence and insights and observations behind the various assumptions on the ways we fight migrant smuggling. So we'll have each of presenters will take 5 minutes, and we will have enough time for your questions and answers. Therefore, we ask you to use Q&A function that to pose your questions. You can target questions also to specific speaker. We also have on CEPS GHA and CEPS think tank accounts ongoing discussion, and also we would like to use the occasion to thank the colleague from Oxford Border Criminologists who have been promoting the event, Euromesco colleagues who are also looking in this very topic of migrant smuggling. And they also have been highlighting today's event, as well as Rizoma project that SEPS and PICOM have been involved previously, that has focused a lot on criminalization of solidarity and prior statistics. So, so thanks a lot for our colleagues and those ongoing projects. At the moment at SEPS, we are having another project called Asile Horizon 2020 that is also, while looking in the global asylum governance, is also looking in the role of migrant smugglers as, on the one hand, providers of the mobility, on the other hand, how EU's and even global approaches are built on assumptions or policies that aim at non-arrival of asylum seekers, especially in an effort to limit spontaneous asylum applications. So these are our projects that also I think our colleagues will be sharing with you. And just before starting off, I would like to thank also SEPS colleagues who have made it possible to be here. So thanks a lot for Miriam Mir, Andrew Falone, Chun Luke, Xavier Hadidi for also helping to organize this event. And of course to Sergio Carrera, who has been behind wealth of behind the research in this area. So without further ado, I would like to start with Gabriela Sanchez. And Gabriela has been involved in the numerous researchers, and what is very interesting that she is also doing a lot of empiric work and interviewing migrants and asylum seekers, and in order to know who are the smugglers and to deconstruct those major misconceptions. So, dear Gabriela, we would like to hear with you and your academic and empiric findings on this topic, and especially in light of upcoming EU action plan against migrant smuggling, what your research finds and what you find as major misconceptions.
Thank you so much, Lena, for the invitation and for all of the energy and time that went into organizing this at such a, late notice. So, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to share some of the insights that collectively, have been emerging over the last few years concerning migrant smuggling. A trend, a debate that is, of course, not unique to the EU, but that does have direct implications into the way the action plan is being developed, and of course, on the lives of people in third countries. So there are a series of points that are often raised regarding migrant smuggling that are very specific to the EU context. And most of them are very much related or tied to this notion of transnational organized crime and what the definition of an organized criminal activity is. And we often hear in EU, Commission or Parliament communications, it's very common that we hear about networks and complexity and the transnational quality of these groups. And then also there are very natural tendencies to prey on migrants, that are traveling to reach Europe. And certainly we cannot and we will not deny the fact that migrants do face incredible amounts of violence during their journeys, not only at the hands of smuggling facilitators, but also at those of law enforcement, including migration authorities, and the general public, including, again, other migrants. And we also, because sometimes some people may believe that, well, maybe are you suggesting or are you saying that smuggling facilitators are all benevolent and we should all, have a different take on what they are? And that's not the point either. And I think that that's where the conversation many times has gotten stuck. People saying, oh, there's good smugglers and bad smugglers. And that is not what we're trying to say. And during this quick intervention, I'm hoping to get to that point, because that is not the only part of the puzzle and what we should be really looking into. What we are concerned about is the way, once again, in which the overall facilitation of irregular migration is approached, how it has been interpreted, and again, the frameworks that are being used to look at it. The facilitation for irregular migration for profit, the one that we designate as smuggling, and the one that is facilitated not for profit, which we're going to be listening to later on from Eugenia. And these notions of networks, of transnational character, of criminality, have led to the emergence of this one-size-fits-all approach. That's all we want to talk about. We just want to talk about networks. We just want to talk about how we're going to be able to contain the criminals and their spread, into Europe. And what the work that collectively, once again, that you're going to hear about today, and that many other people who are not joining us today, but who are probably watching, have carried out, has precisely tried to disturb that notions. Like, we are not talking about these networks, and in fact, the word network has to be used in a more careful way. Also, the work that Roberto Farin is later on going to share with us is going to also explain and shed light on how this complexity, comes about, that many times gets lost in all of the discourse on transnational organized crime. What we have seen is that many of these policies, many of these measures, to detain or to contain the so-called networks, are impacting the livelihoods of communities across third countries and also within Europe. And by focusing, or by only talking on this image of a smuggler as male, we are also obscuring the participation of women, young people, and children who also rely on the facilitation of migration for profit as a way to generate an income. There's a very recent report from IOM that actually, refers to smuggling for subsistence smuggling. This notion of generating income, not to contribute to a network, but actually just to be able to get by. And we see this in many of the works that are going to be discussed today, and again, and the work that many other researchers have been developing. And perhaps one of the points that we really need to emphasize, because the academic discourse, is often criticized in the sense that we're not connecting, with our empirical findings with policy, or with ways that are actually action, things that can actually be implemented on the ground. So what I want to talk about today are, to give 3 specific recommendations that can be in fact implemented related to the way in which we develop knowledge. We develop and disseminate knowledge concerning the facilitation of irregular migration for profit, or, as we will see later on, not for profit, the one that is not generating any kind of material benefit. And the first point, the first way that we can, reduce some of these challenges is by destroying this echo chamber in which we live. If we look around, if we think about most of the events that we join, you will see it's most of the time the same people. We get to see each other quite often. And, of course, I certainly love to see all of you, but at the same time, we are just talking with each other. We are not bringing more people into the conversation. There is really not a lot of more diversity in the way we think about, some of these topics. Also, the dynamics and the way that policy or rather counter-smuggling policies is spoken about is still a very quite male-dominated area, in which, notions that are not necessarily inclusive of gender are brought up into the conversations and the discussions. In talking about which, that leads us to the fact that we are in need and desperate need for more work that looks precisely at the ways in which gender, race, and class intersect. It is very surprising that we hardly ever bring the issue of race when we are talking about people and communities who have been, highly criminalized. And my third point, and thanks to Andrew for, sharing this list of contributions that I am in the little chat box, is the very fact that we need to level the playing field, that we need to open the discussion precisely to third country, female, junior scholars and policymakers. They have so much to say. And today we are, of course, joined by two of these researchers, who are going to contribute and share with us some of their critical findings. There's also, of course, the work of many others that you're going to see coming up in your chat, on your chat box. Aklam Shmeli, Lina Richter, Fatima Masawi, Federico Lagna, and of course, the speakers that follow right after me, Keira Arusha and Roxana De Masol. So I will leave it at that and leave the floor to our colleagues. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much, Gabriela, for highlighting how important it is to link our evidence and research to the policy field and work, and to try to make the way for this evidence in EU policy making. And we definitely are happy that European Commission is following the better regulation guidelines, and in light of which this public consultation is being organized. And we really hope that some of your evidence will be reflected in the new plan that hopefully will be better than the previous one. So with this, I will give over the microphone to Eugenia Kusumano, who has been focusing a lot on search and rescue issues, Mediterranean. It's really interesting because when Ylva Johansson was announcing the public consultation, she said, "I blame the smugglers for the death in the Mediterranean," and there is kind of, they are seen like a pull factor, if you wish. Well, same has been said about civil society. So, Eugenia, what do you make of that, and what would be your contribution into this public consultation? What policymakers should take on board from what you saw so far?
Thank you so much, Lina. Thanks everybody for being here. As already mentioned, my expertise focuses not so much on human smuggling, but on irregular migration governance at sea and at the importance of sea rescue operations. Since I only have 5 minutes, I will focus on just a couple of aspects of the new EU action plan against smuggling, more broadly, the European Union approach against irregular migration, and stress one important aspect that EU policymakers should carefully consider: the humanitarian externalities of anti-smuggling policies. I will focus on the Central Mediterranean corridor, but the argument is applicable to other seaborne migratory routes as well. We probably heard about the latest shipwreck off the coast of Libya, which caused at least 50 deaths in early May. Unfortunately, and I will now be sharing a slide with you, this is not an isolated event. Official figures from the International Organization for Migration show us that indeed, you should be able to see the slides now, casualties are on the rise, both on the Central Mediterranean corridor as well as in other routes. We have seen a decrease in the Atlantic route, for instance, relative to last year, but more broadly, the figures point to the possibility that indeed we should be witnessing a new increase in casualties at sea. The 2015-2020 action plan that the European Commission published aims to transform human smuggling from a low-risk, high-return business into a high-risk, low-return one. The key question that is unanswered here is whose risk we are talking about. The formula that the European Commission uses remains silent on the possibility that anti-smuggling policies do not only increase the risk for smugglers to be apprehended, but also increase the risk to the life and safety of those crossing the central Mediterranean, as well as other migratory corridors. As you can see from the next slide, the risk attached to crossing the Mediterranean, the central Mediterranean specifically, have indeed increased over the last year. To be sure, casualties at sea are a complex phenomenon that is the outcome of a variety of different factors and cannot be solely attributed to a programmatic document like the EU Anti-Smuggling Action Plan. Nevertheless, there are some aspects of the European Union approach that might indeed be problematic from a humanitarian standpoint. There are two that are especially relevant. One is the effort that is indeed explicitly mentioned in the latest anti-smuggling action plan, is the effort to identify, capture, and dispose of the vessels used by smugglers. As data shows, and as some leaked document from the EU Common Security and Defense Policy Operation EUNAVFOR Sophia also admits, the destruction of boats has prompted a shift in smugglers' modus operandi that has led to the use of more unseaworthy rubber boats. This is an aspect that should be considered for future EU anti-smuggling effort. The second aspect, and this is what the kind introduction that Lina and also Gabriela before her gave me focuses on, is the criminalisation of solidarity and of sea rescue operations specifically. The figures that we have, you can see, I'm especially referring to the period between June 2018 and August 2019, show us that the period where the deadliness of the Central Mediterranean route peaked was also the period where no search and rescue operations from NGOs, as well as European Union state assets, were present at sea. And the only actor that was indeed available for sea rescue operations or interdiction operation of the coast of Libya was Tripoli's Navy and Coast Guard. Unfortunately, we are now witnessing a situation that resembles to that period, due to both these ongoing criminalization efforts now based more on administrative proceedings as opposed to criminal law, but with the very same effect, which are actually combined with the logistical hurdles that are associated with COVID-19 and all that it entails, have created a situation whereby the presence of sea rescue assets at sea is very low, and as a result, the deadliness of the crossing has increased at large. So to conclude, I think that given this risk, it is vital that the next iteration of the EU Action Plan broadens the notion of risk and focuses on the risks attached to migrants as well. Rather than indulging in the simplistic slogan that combating human smuggling is in the interest of migrants themselves, future EU strategies should acknowledge that the fight against human smuggling may have unintended humanitarian implications and therefore requires a careful humanitarian impact assessment. I will stop here and I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Eugenia, for also providing the statistics and delinking the presence of civil society from those tragedies that sometimes also civil society has been blamed as encouraging factor. And I think yours and Mateus Vila's article in the special journal issue on European criminal policy has very well illustrated this point. And now I'm moving to Roxana De Masol de Rebets, whose research also focused on the law enforcement officials. She has been interviewing a lot of prosecutors and police officers, if I understand correctly, and has been also trying to look what are the challenges for them and what are challenges in general in fighting the migrant smuggling, and what are the major misconceptions that we see in EU's policy. So Roxana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lina, and thank you, Eugenia and Gabriela, for this very interesting presentation and very nuanced take on the phenomenon. So as Lina explained, I will just, in order to keep it very short to the five minutes, normally my research is focusing on the gray area, the zones of intersection between migrant smuggling and human trafficking, because there are very clear-cut and distinguished phenomena, but what the empirical scholarship is highlighting is that there is a lot of zones of intersection between one and the other, which can also make it hard for frontline implementers to deal with these very strict legal taxonomies and to categorize individuals as either a victim of human trafficking or as an object of migrant smuggling. But in this presentation, and in direct line with the EU Action Plan against migrant smuggling, I will focus on the scope of the facilitation crime, and which can be narrowed down to the question of who is a smuggler or who should be considered as such. And Eugenia already provided a lot of information when it comes to the criminalisation of humanitarian assistance, but I will look at one zone of intersection between migrant smuggling and human trafficking. And to do so, I'm basing myself on my empirical research conducted in Belgium, where with several police officers, investigators, but also with prosecutors, are confronted with the issue of migrants being stranded or stuck in motion in transit zones within the Schengen area, and are confronted to the difficult issue of facing individuals who are involved themselves in the smuggling processes at very low level, yet visible stage of the smuggling process, and ask themselves, am I facing a smuggler and therefore a criminal who should then be punished and sentenced, or am I looking at a potential victim of human trafficking with a potential, an abuse of a situation of vulnerability and an exploit and some traces of exploitation as well. So I think this is very important, because when we look at the narrative that is presented either by EU Commissioner Johansson or in the roadmap, we see, and then I quote here the EU Commission, who indicates that migrant smuggling very often involves the organized exploitation of migrants, showing scant respect for human life in the pursuit of profits. So two elements are there in the narrative, the for-profit and the link with organized crime. However, and this is where Gabriela's intervention I found very nuanced and interesting, we're not denying the fact that there are organized crime groups who are taking advantage for profit of migrants when it comes to the smuggling processes. But what empirical research also shows is that the reality is sometimes a bit more messy and a bit more complex. And Gabriela's research already collected a lot of work, a lot of research from scholars who are showing how migrants themselves can be involved in smuggling operation, but also the social embeddedness of the smuggling processes. And when we look in Belgium at the case where you have individuals vulnerable, stranded in, for example, the Maximilian Park, who are then involved in the smuggling processes, namely conducting counter observation, opening the trucks on parking rest area along the speedways to reach, the UK. It's a thorny issue for prosecutors when they're facing this kind of individuals. And I have two interesting quotes, which shows that there is a lack of consensus on how to handle this situation. According to some prosecutor, this is clear, it's a complete migrant smuggling case. You have a material benefit, because they're doing it in exchange for a free ride later on. So there is the for-profit dimension. On the other hand, other prosecutors are like, no, there is an abuse of a situation of vulnerability. The person in front of me is not necessarily a smuggler, it's potentially a victim of human trafficking. And here I have one quote saying, people that are on these parking lots opening the trucks at night are the most vulnerable. They are the ones that will be found by the police, that will be locked up and quickly sentenced. This is from one prosecutor, for example. I had someone went further from the foreigner's office explaining, when a criminal organization comes and make them an offer, they basically cannot refuse. What is the alternative? Sitting in Calais for another year, not knowing what will happen every day? Okay, I need to do something dangerous, but then I have two new organized attempts that could potentially succeed, maybe in the path towards the UK. So this absence of consensus, but also it's really linked back to this for-profit and organized crime group that has to be there, because here can we really see some sort of criminal intent on behalf of the smugglers who are involved in the low-level process of the smuggling activity. Yes, there is potentially a material benefit, but how do we define this? How do we identify potential indicators for exploitation when we're working in stressful conditions at the front line? So I think what we can recommend is going back to Palermo, having the profit, the organized crime link, and having more training and sensibilization to human trafficking indicators. And this is where I stop.
Thank you so much, Roxana, also to helping to get out for us from these echo chambers by including these perspectives and challenges that law enforcement face. And I think it's so important to understand them in order for this new EU action plan for 2025 to be more effective and efficient, and seeing how completely different interpretations can follow from kind of ambiguity and vagueness provided within EU law, and namely EU Facilitation Directive. I think Michelle will come back to that, but now I will pass the floor for Keira Arusha, and her empiric research has been in particularly interesting because a lot of EU efforts are directed to those partner countries, especially in in Central Mediterranean, in North Africa, that are kind of seen as places of transit and potentially places of migrant smuggling. So what are your empiric research showing, and what kind of suggestions you would have for European Commission in light of these consultations?
Thank you, Lina. Thank you so much for the invitation. So today I will be sharing with you some empirical findings on the case of Algeria, and I would like to highlight some of the current trends and counter-smuggling policy in response in North Africa, with a particular focus on the case of Algeria. And as you know, Algeria remained like the missing piece in the study of sub-Saharan migration or irregular migration, and still it's an unexamined case study. So the empirical findings of my research on the sub-Saharan mobility experiences challenge the pervasive conceptualization of the facilitation of irregular migration as connected to the transnational criminal networks. The first point of my intervention that I want to highlight is that the empirical data suggests that when seen from the perspective of the migrant, neither smuggling networks nor other forms of transnationally organized criminality, as defined by the EU authorities and policymakers, appear to play a significant role in irregular journeys of the sub-Saharan migrant or of the irregular migrant nationals from Algeria. In the case of the sub-Saharan migrants, usually they rely on the border residents who have been facilitating their movement, providing transportation, accommodation, advice on routes or destination. And these communities have been circulating in and out in the south of Algeria, across towards Niger and Mali, for a long decade without any subject to legal regulations by the government. However, with the deterioration of their socioeconomic conditions and the intensive securitarization of the borders after the instability in this region and the collapse of the Libyan routes, these communities start putting their territory navigation knowledge, migratory experiences, contacts at their disposal to arrange the crossing of the migrant, mainly from Central Africa, mainly communities of Niger, Cameroon, and other from West Africa. Most of them engage in these activities to sustain their livelihoods and their conditions, and there's no convergence between these groups and other criminal groups. How the migrants perceive the work of the smugglers. Usually the migrants, from the interviews, they consider them as gatekeepers for knowledge, advice on routes, destination, opportunities of work, and as mainly facilitators of their journeys. It's true, the services of the smugglers are in place and provided for the migrant. However, we need to acknowledge the agency and the autonomy of the migrant over their trajectories. The migrants I have met, they express their, they don't want to rely, or they do not tend to rely heavily on the services of the smugglers to facilitate their journeys. Usually the migrants receive information of a particular, prior to their departure, of a particular smuggler who is trustworthy, from a friend, and who did arrange the passage of other migrants safely. However, they opt not to use the services of the migrant, and they would rather go through different countries. For instance, was the case of the migrant from Cameroon who tried to avoid crossing through Niger or using the smuggler services, and opt to remain independent on their way of the journey, crossing different countries, relying on the migrants they would met along the route or the communities of the borders, rather than using the services of the migrant. As well, a lot of migrants upon their arrival into Algeria, especially in the south of Tamanrasset, where it's a hub of smugglers, facilitators of migration, where they provide them with accommodation. But even upon their arrival, they tend just to accumulate the necessary knowledge about how they can reach the northern part of Algeria, and they opt to look for alternatives like buying a bus ticket or train tickets, rather than using the smugglers to reach the northern part of Algeria. In the case of Northern African irregular migrants, the dynamics of irregular migratory journeys and their facilitations are still poorly understood. And due to the lack of legal pathways, we identify different ways of organizing their journeys across the Mediterranean in irregular way. For instance, the self-funded or self-facilitated efforts, where a group of people who knows each other, they put their resources with the help of their family or friends, neighborhoods or diaspora, and skills and knowledge of others in the group to arrange their crossings without any reliance or help of smugglers. So when looking at the logic of the migrant's journey, the strategies, the practicalities of migration facilitation challenge the normative constructions of smugglers that obscures the increase in risks and criminalisation that migrants face in Algeria, as well as other North African countries, and the current EU-financed irregular migration controls. The second point that I would like to as well highlight, or want to question, the efficiency of counter-smuggling or irregular migration strategies in Algeria, with the focus on the findings of Algeria. So the law in Algeria criminalizes irregular migration, both of the citizens and non-citizens. And as you know, Algeria, the presence of the sub-Saharan migrants in Algeria, it has been portrayed by the government as a threat to the national order, a source of crimes, diseases, drugs, trafficking. So most of the effort have been devoted to counter their movement through the weekly mass arbitrary refoulement or forced removal strategies from the northern cities, sending them to the southern cities or the borders with Niger. And through the practice of refoulement, the migrants are placed under constant deportability, facing violence and discrimination without regard to their migration status, whether they are asylum seekers, refugees, or regular migrants, which is the case of the Malian. The empirical findings show that these attempts to counter irregular migration are often ineffective in deterring irregular migration or the use of smugglers. However, it increases the demand on the smuggling services. And sub-Saharan migrants often, they find their way back to northern Algeria, covering the expenses with hidden savings or with assisted by, or they can be assisted by their friends who send them money after they return. Although it is frustrating and tiring due to the refoulement, the migrant I have met, they usually have been refooled several times, more than 10 times, and they always find their way to go back to Algeria. So these forced returns do not discourage or put an end to their journeys. Some they decide to return true to their origin countries, while others they may opt to just relocate on other cities rather than moving to the northern cities. Many others that are tired of harassment and many times burdened by debts, they ultimately decide to pursue their journeys to Morocco and then cross from Morocco to Europe. Whereas for the case of the national irregular migrants, Algerians, they usually faced 2 to 6 months imprisonment, or they can be subject to pay a lot of fines. However, neither fines nor incarceration serve as a deterrent for them, as departures continue to take place for several times. So this is the current trends of irregular migration dynamics in Algeria. And I will conclude here. I don't want to exceed more time.
Thank you so much, Keira, and for this very illuminating, I would say, empiric evidence that you have managed to gather, and I'm sure it needs to be shared widely, your findings, and this aspect that the return policies or these incarcerations are not effective, does not this discouraging effect that we see in the previous plan. There has been a lot of emphasis on that, and the knowledge on how the migrant business model evolves around that basically migrants receive several attempts to cross in order to make their way, and and here, using your point on this trust between migrants and smugglers, I would like also to highlight the research of our colleague Andrew Falone, who has also shed the light on information asymmetries and how sometimes by so much focusing on removing the online content of smugglers, migrants simply lose information on who was the smuggler in order to make them kind of accountable, or so others would not trust them. This is another interesting research we would like to share, I think, on Twitter. And with that, I'm moving to our panelists, to our discussants, coming from civil society, and namely Roberto Farin, who is from Mixed Migration Center, and Mixed Migration Center has been also involved in conducting a lot of empiric research with migrants and asylum seekers. So we would like to hear from you when speaking with the clients or beneficiaries. What are your key insights, and how do you see, or what still needs to be reflected in the new EU action plan, and what do you see as the major misconceptions? and also what you have heard so far from academic research. How does it align with what you witness on the ground?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Lina. Thank you for inviting us to this very important and topical debate, and very happy and privileged to be speaking alongside so many smuggling experts. And then unsurprisingly, considering how many experts have been speaking before me, I don't think I have much to add to what has been said in terms of key messages, but as you said, Lina, perhaps to reinforce and support some of the key messages sent alongside so far with some of the data and the research from our activities in the field. So perhaps, yeah, four really short key messages. The first, echoing what Gabriela was saying at the beginning, which is something that is quite obvious, but apparently still need to be reinforced, is that the importance of a balanced narrative on smuggling and smugglers. On the one hand, not all smugglers are evil criminal. On the other, not all of them are service provider, and then there is this tendency to try to want to put them in one corner or the other, depending on where people stand in the migration debate. What we see in the field, people are telling us that the reality is much more nuanced and complex. I can give an example. We ask people 2 questions toward the end of our survey for a data collection about how they sort of perceive smugglers. One question is, to what extent do you agree with the following statement: I was intentionally misled about the journey by my smuggler or smugglers? And another question that we ask right after that is, to what extent do you agree with the following statement: the smuggler or smugglers I use helped me in achieving my goal of migrating to another country. And then I'm using the data for a snapshot that we are publishing this week about smuggling dynamics for Afghan toward Europe. And then when we ask the first question about whether they've been misled, 55% either agree or strongly agree that they've been misled by smugglers. And then when we ask if smugglers, they were useful, they were providing an important services in migrating to another country, 56% said that they agree or strongly agree with that. And then many of them are the same people. And this gives us, I think, a very strong indication that smugglers at the same time are a problem, a risk for state, but also for refugees and migrants involved. But at the same time, they are providing an essential service. And then this essential service is mobility, which is the reason for which many of these people are on the move. So I think that this need of nuancing this understanding and this narrative around smuggling still is important. The second is about, again, a bit of in the area of binary thinking or myth on smuggling. What has been said also by Gabriela, but also by others, this idea that smuggling network are powerful and large criminal network. I mean, to begin with, this is only true in certain geographies, and then in certain contexts, this can change. But more importantly is that this approach to smuggling, as if we are dealing with international criminal network, as a secondary impact of, as I think Keira and Roxana were saying, that all smugglers are treated as if they were equal. Whereas, as we know, within the same smuggler network, we have different roles, and then highly, power imbalance between people that have all a lot of responsibility and power over others, which are sort of victimized within the same smuggling network. The third, which has been also mentioned, but perhaps I would like to reaffirm, is the importance of corruption and the involvement of state authority into the smuggling business. Smuggling business could not, in many geographies, exist without the involvement and tolerance of border authority, state authority. And then corruption is very central. We've been conducting research on this. We have for my data, I can share an article later on about how central corruption is to irregularity and therefore to smuggling business. And then we think that this should be mentioned as a central element of an approach to smuggling, and we don't see that reflected as much in the old and new plan. And then perhaps the last point, it's about anti-smuggling and then approach to anti-smuggling. We think that there are quite important lessons learned from the past, not so much on war on smuggling, which is to a certain extent quite new, but from wars that have been waged toward criminal network in the past. And then the most important is probably the war on drugs, which has been a policy and operational response to the problem of narco trafficking in particularly in Central Latin America. There are very important lessons learned about how to tackle a criminal network, the importance of tackling, considering the power imbalance that exists, if we don't want to let a situation where we are going to basically reinforce stronger networks and then amongst a more diffuse organization within such network. About the impact of a certain criminalization on demand, for instance. We have a paper which we use to compare war on drugs and war on smuggling, and we think that there are extremely important and valid lessons learned in the first that can be used for the second. I'll close just mentioning very quickly two activities we are involved because we think that they are important. We have been organizing together with UNHCR a workshop in North Africa about protection response in the context of migration and irregular migration. And then we are coming up soon with a roadmap for better policy response together with UNHCR is coming out soon, this roadmap, so I suggest to keep an eye. And then the second is that we are part of the UNODC Observatory on Migrant Smuggling. The website is going to be launched soon. And then we are also part of that as data collection. In both of these activity and program, we try to bring this knowledge, these key messages, this need for going beyond binary thinking and narrative and toward more complexity in the discussion. So I think that there are two initiatives that are worth to be looking at. And I close with this. Thank you very much. And back to you, Lina.
Thank you so much, Roberto. And could you also share with all the attendees the research you have mentioned? Because I'm sure we have a lot of attendees from what I can see from coming from civil society, also from some institutions, even UNODC colleagues. So I think it would be very relevant for them also to see what are the latest research and latest evidence gathered. And with this, I'm moving also to our final discussant, Michelle Lavoie, that director of PICUM, who the organization who has been focusing a lot also on the rights of migrants and of smuggled migrants and those who assist them. With PICUM, as we mentioned, we have been also cooperating in RISOMA project, and some interesting insights came from there, but I'm leaving here, I'm just giving over to Michelle, what you would like to highlight, since you have been following this issue for a long while, and especially in light of assuring the rights of smuggled migrants, because in UN Migrant Smuggling Protocol, as well as in the UN Global Compact on for migration, we see that the rights of smuggled migrants should be somehow assured, but in the new action plan, what concretely could be done, and some aspects on criminalisation of solidarity, if you could touch upon. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lina, for organizing this especially, but also all the researchers for your inputs, which have been very interesting to hear, and also to Roberto's comments from the Mixed Migration Center. I would start by saying that within PICUM, we've been following the EU Common Asylum and Migration Agenda since it's existed, and that's existed for 22 years. We've actually, this year, we're existing now for 20 years. And I would say that throughout this whole time, in general, we've observed at PICUM that this conflation of criminal law and immigration policy has made migrants less safe. It's put them in harm's way, and it's made them more susceptible to being victimized. I think we've heard that from some of the researchers who've said that some of these counter-smuggling policies are based on limited empirical data. They're influenced by Eurocentric perspectives. And also many of these efforts that the EU has done, and also in third countries, may be ineffective, they may be counterproductive, and they may have unintended effects. Some of the ones that I think are striking that we've seen even just this past weekend, when I wanted to start with, are impacts on migrants themselves, kind of who is actually a smuggler. And sometimes it's also questioning just this role that a person might have within their own family. There was a case that was just ruled in Greece of a Syrian man who's been sentenced to 53 years in prison because he was accused of facilitating illegal entry and causing a shipwreck after the Greek authorities accused him of being at the helm of a boat that he was steering that eventually brought him and his family and 40 people to safety. And then there were these very tragic cases of parents, actually. In November, or in the fall, the Greek authorities arrested an Afghan man whose son had died, one attempting to reach a Greek island from Turkey. He was arrested because of the suspicion of endangering a life, a crime that could carry a penalty of up to 10 years in prison. In November, police in Senegal arrested a man whose 15-year-old son died while making a crossing at sea. The man had paid 450 euros for his son to make the crossing, and the man, so the father, was arrested on charges of complicity in the smuggling of migrants. So we see numerous cases of this where family members are accused of smuggling. But as you've mentioned, Alina, in the Rhizoma project, we've also seen cases of individuals who are considered smugglers because they're just helping, basically. So the Rhizoma research found between 2015 and 2019 that there were 171 human rights defenders who were investigated or convicted on grounds related to the facilitation directive at the EU. This is most likely an undercount. This is also something that we saw within our project. But these cases were involving volunteers, activists, NGOs, crew members of rescue ships, migrants' family members, journalists, mayors, and priests. So what we saw that was more or less common with these cases is that the member states of the EU are prosecuting activities which are carried out on humanitarian grounds, where we don't see any link with transnational organized crime. We don't see any link with financial or material benefit. Interesting, last year in September, the Commission finally released some guidance on how to implement the facilitation directive. Yet all of us were waiting for this for a long time. And what is disappointing is that it only invites member states not to criminalize acts that are mandated by law. So what's mandated by law? Search and rescue, life-saving. Okay, that's promising, but what's acts which are permitted by law, which aren't in this guidance? Permitted by law might be providing food, shelter, bringing migrants in a car in mountainous regions to avoid hypothermia, giving shelter. So all of this is excluded from the guidelines, and especially if they're not carried out by an NGO that's mandated. So this almost exclusive focus on search and rescue leaves out other things that are in the territory and away from kind of the external borders, and that wouldn't necessarily be considered life-saving. So we see that smuggling legislation, which does not explicitly exclude normal interactions and transactions with undocumented without undue financial profit, also impacts access to fundamental rights. So while migrants already face discrimination in the housing market, such provisions, or the fear of such provisions, relegate migrants who are undocumented, including families with children, to precarious, overcrowded, unsuitable housing, which is often at exploitative rent prices and increases risks of eviction, abuse, and theft of rent and deposits. We also see that there's, and these previous speakers have all mentioned this, that there's a risk that these restrictive policies could create even more situations where there could be human rights abuses. We see that state policies that increase border control and surveillance and reduce opportunities for safe and regular migration have, in a sense, maybe inadvertently created a market for irregular migration because of this reliance on smugglers and the more dangerous routes. We heard actually from Eugenia, one of the unintended consequences is the number of deaths at sea. I also wanted to mention some IOM data, which has indicated that since 2014, more than 20,000 people have drowned in the Mediterranean. And this is at a time when the EU has had its anti-smuggling policy. So we've also seen that this focus on increasing the number of return rates in the EU is being conflated with fighting migrant smuggling. Measures which increase the numbers of deportations by creating a general restrictive climate within the EU in which service providers, people in the justice system may believe, and in many cases, they might actually have an obligation to report someone who's undocumented to the immigration authorities. These practices aren't also harmful, but they're also counterproductive if the EU has a goal to fight exploitation. It's interesting that the current action plan against migrant smuggling for 2015 to 2020 indicates that the Commission would take a stronger action to reduce incentives for irregular migration and the exploitation of migrants. Yet we within PICUM know very well within exploitation that if you don't allow someone who's exploited to report to authority that they're exploited in a safe way, they won't actually denounce any vulnerability. So in general, we find that this current criminal framework might be unfit for purpose. We find that the harm it does to migrant communities is disproportionate in relation to its impact in fighting transnational criminal organizations. So just to conclude, we have 3 recommendations for the new action plan. The first one, you alluded to this, Alina, at the beginning. The first one is to ensure that legislation and measures to fight smuggling aren't used against people acting for humanitarian purposes, nor against migrant communities when they're providing assistance or shelter. So what would this mean? To narrow, and I think one of the researchers referred to this as well, narrow the interpretation of the crime of migrant smuggling in line with the migrant smuggling protocol. Limiting this to acts carried out to obtain unjust profit and in connection with transnational organized crime. So basically the interpretation of the crime of smuggling should ensure that undocumented migrants can uphold their fundamental rights, including access to services, housing, and collective organizing. The second recommendation is to collect and publish evidence-based disaggregated data on the implementation of the Facilitation Directive, as well as the number of investigations and convictions on migrant smuggling related grounds. This data we don't seem to have easily obtainable, and yet we are in a context in which we need to see more evidence of how the impact of this directive is actually on the ground. And the third and final recommendation is to shift the narrative. This is a much bigger attempt, but basically refocus the efforts to reduce irregular migration, which are currently focusing on border control and criminalisation, towards efforts to promote good practices at the national level around regular pathways and regularization that are promoting decent work and social inclusion. I'll leave it at that for now, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And indeed, we have seen that also in SEPS research that a number of activities are seen as even as unintended smuggling that come somehow in the view of EU Migrant Smuggling Center. For instance, we saw also BlaBlaCar provider, without checking the documents of the passenger, could become unintended smuggler, or the same for Airbnb. That it's interesting that it's not only like civil society organizations, they are targeted by and large, but also private enterprises, and as you mentioned, landlords can also be targeted, and these are EU citizens. So in a way, we are even stepping in the realm of EU citizens' rights, also citizen right being the right to assembly and association with migrants. So here we have some questions now popping up, and we would like to all of you attendees and participants to be very active here. We have received a question from Tobias Schmidt from Friedrich Ebert Foundation, and there are three interconnected questions that I will just read it out, and I will ask you who would like to answer. First of all, since there is no or little safe corridors to Europe as destination of asylum, how do we deal with the seemingly necessity of migrant smuggling to reach safety? And I guess, yeah, if someone of you would like to take it, and I guess this relates again to spontaneous arrivals of asylum seekers and the Geneva Convention that have not provided clarity on this question, how they should reach EU, even they have such right. And secondly, wouldn't highly organized human traffickers use less suspicious legal channels, such as tourist visas, to get their victims into the EU to exploit them there? On this question, I guess Gabriela or Roxane could elaborate, since your research focuses on human trafficking. And following this reason, wouldn't anti-smuggling policies to strengthen EU land and sea borders not simply affect only those who try to reach safety, and not those who are victims of trafficking? Okay, so I think this one could also be answered either by Gabriela or Roxane. So maybe let's start with Gabriela then.
I would like to give the floor to Roxane, unless you want me to go. But I think you have more specific information on that.
But honestly, I'm not. The thing is, like the main way of migration, also illegally, is also via tourist visa that are expired and everything. So yes, highly organized human traffickers can use these channels. This is already happening a lot. So I'm not sure I really fully understand this question, because this is already the case. So yeah.
I would also, Tobias, thanks for your question. And I would also make a very clear distinction here. We're talking about smuggling and not necessarily trafficking. Of course, they come, there's elements of both crimes and how they come together. But here you are bringing a different dynamic, which is, again, human traffickers and other mechanisms that they employ. What the empirical evidence shows is that trafficking for the purpose of labor exploitation many times occurs in different channels related, when you think about the ones that are employed in migrant smuggling. The work of Paolo Campana at Cambridge, really shows specific examples that are present in the legal record. Trafficking entities tend to, or want, have placed a different value, in the kinds of people that they are transporting, compared to the ones to the cost that is imposed onto migrants who rely on migrant smuggling. Again, happy to talk about that in more detail.
Perhaps I can add something very quickly here. Another way of saying what Gabriela just said, which I think is very important, is that if, as we keep saying, there are doubt about how strong and organized criminal networks are when it comes to smuggling, when it comes to trafficking and exploitation, we know that there is a very strong prevalence of very highly organized, criminalized, strong network. And therefore, they will be always ahead of smuggling or some smugglers in finding way to circumvent rules and regulations that they apply to border crossing, to mobility in the area of anti-smuggling. Over.
In short, we're talking about different organizations and different structures.
Would maybe Michelle would like to elaborate a bit on this impossibility of coming legally or
Yes.
pathways question?
Yes, thank you. It's interesting when you look at the current regular pathways that the EU has. So basically, there are a couple of key instruments. There's the Blue Card Directive, there's the Single Permit, there's the Seasonal Workers Directive, there's the Intra-Corporate Transferees Directive, there's the Students and Researchers Directive, there's the Family Reunification Directive. And then there's also people who are coming and trying to seek asylum, and so wouldn't necessarily be bound by any of those directives. But even if you just look at just these instruments that the EU has, none of them are really an adequate response concerning regular pathways. And even the ones that exist have some serious concerns. For example, just this directive on family reunification, and this is also a reason why a lot of people are taking irregular crossings, is because they are trying to reunite with family members. There is the Initiative for Child Rights in the Global Compact on Migration, which Lena had mentioned also earlier, that made a submission to the review of the Europe region for the UN Global Compact on Migration. And their submission had found that there are many administrative barriers for children to reunite with their families. They're complicated, they're costly to prove that they're actually a child or of a parent or a husband of a wife. So for example, there's required DNA testing. Some of the barriers are high income requirements. Some of them are short deadlines. So many of these people who want to actually have bona fide family reunification can't actually access them. And the other point that I wanted to mention is what Gabriela referred to at the end of her presentation about having an intersectional approach to smuggling, which is currently really lacking. And what does this also mean? It means we think also within the whole migration field that it also has to be aligned more with the EU Action Plan Against Racism, which was adopted in September last year, which aims to step up action against racism and achieve a union of equality. Just one figure that I find still quite perplexing, for the year 2018, Eurostat data revealed that 5% of all first-time permits that were issued for remunerated activities, which would be work permits and researchers, were given to nationals of 55 countries in Africa. So the whole continent of Africa got 5% of first-time permits for researchers or work in 2018. Obviously, the rest of the world got 95% of the other ones, but it does show a big imbalance geographically. So we need to make these connections more explicit. And part of it is also through data, but it's also analysis. And so I think with not doing so, we will continue to have most likely policies which are having unintended consequences and which also might reinforce racism.
Thank you so much, Michelle. And actually, our SEPS research on legal migration also showed that only 2.1% of all blue cards up until, I think, in the first implementation phase has been issued to sub-Saharan Africa. And this question of linking the legal pathways is indeed a very relevant one. And then there is a question to which extent the newly proposed talent partnerships and the legal pathways, complementary legal pathways, will be responsive to the increasing needs and demand that exists in Europe for also undocumented migrant labor that UN Special Rapporteur on Migrant Rights, Francois Crépeau, has been very explicit about. And I would like now to move also to another question that has been, and I would like to address it to Eugenia. To what extent do you think it would be central to use the digital infrastructure tools such as drone surveillance cameras, satellites, to stop and reduce illegal immigration, whether via sea, land, and how to cope weaken the networks of smugglers or illegal immigration? And I'm asking you because on the one hand, Eurosur, the system that has been there in the Central Med to kind of to save the lives, you know, on the one extent, it was kind of reused to fight migrant smugglers. And if you have, in your research, have you done any insights of these multiple uses of this information and whether getting more aerial surveillance would get, let's say, less migrant smuggling or less death in the sea?
Right, thanks, Lena. I'm not really an expert of this, but I could say a couple of things. And the first thing that I would stress is that we're walking on a tightrope here. We need to be very careful. There is no doubt that technology can play an important role in rescuing lives at sea. Indeed, we had evidence that both the European Union missions and some NGOs, like the Migrant Offshore Aid Station, use the unmanned aerial surveillance assets with some success. And those have been important for surveillance in order to save lives. When it comes to the use of surveillance assets by the European Union, on the other hand, what we need to be careful about is that they do not translate into yet another instrument for interdiction. What is really at stake is that if the European Union uses its surveillance assets and transfers information to the Libyan Coast Guard and Navy, to Libyan authorities, they would indeed provide a strong boost to interdiction efforts. And the reason why the EU should be careful about this is also based on self-interest. In that case, if there is clear evidence of a transfer of data from the European Union to actors like the Libyan Coast Guard, it would be very hard for the EU to deny that they're not indeed directly involved and they do not enjoy some form of direct control over the migrants, which would then activate European Court of Human Rights jurisdiction and make European action illegal as a violation of the non-refoulement obligation.
Thank you, Eugenia. And to our knowledge, there is at the moment one case pending at the European Court of Human Rights SS versus Italy that is trying also to pursue this kind of reasoning. And sorry, I missed, Keira also had something to contribute, I think, on this legal pathways question. Am I correct, Keira? Because
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add something to what Michelle already mentioned. And in the case of North African, like this, the current available legal pathways in North Africa, Algerians, for instance, they cannot access to this legal pathways. A lot of them, their visas have been rejected for no reasons. And there have been a lot of complaints about this. I have interviewed a few cases who have been applying for family reunification towards France, but they have been exhausted all their resources. They have presented all the requirements, the necessary documents, but all the time their applications have been rejected. So even within the legal pathways, it's not possible to reach a safe to get a visa or to reach friends, for instance. And what I just wanted to add here is, sorry, I just missed the point. Yeah, I will just conclude here.
Thank you and welcome, Stephen, because indeed also civil society organizations had evidence of those who have been applying for visa and not getting the visa, then turned to smugglers. And I think this link is also under, and at the same point, there is no accountability for those national administrations for not issuing a visa and the reasons why the visa has not been issued. And here is maybe the point of Roberto's, that sometimes then this leads to corruption. And one of the scandals in Belgium have broken out about family reunification schemes, and actually under humanitarian visa has been used by actually national authorities for how to say with the corruption elements. And this is really important aspect underlooked in the current plan. I would like to move to another question by Federico Alana, who is asking whether and how we could improve the role of evidence and human rights-based approaches, that they would serve better EU policy making and beside and outside formal consultations. I guess Roberto or Michelle will be here best fit to respond. Maybe Roberto? How let's say also Mixed Migration Center is improving the role of evidence and human rights.
I was trying to unmute myself, what we do most of the time these days, trying to unmute. Well, I would say that this is obviously something that goes well beyond anti-smuggling, and perhaps I'll turn this into a sort of call for action, and I'm not sure it was the intended purpose, but we know that the budget for the new Global Europe, the DG, is being discussed, and we know that it's a significant budget. We know that there is a 10% given to migration specific, but we know that also beyond this 10% it is given to migration, quite a lot of the focus of that instrument will be looking at aspects that have importance for migration. And then I think it will be extremely important to be sure that a significant part of that, not a significant, but as big as needed part of that budget investment will be made on data collection, analysis, research. And then we think that that is the case for making policy making better. We have been saying, I think, over and over today, how a better understanding of mobility, in this case of smuggling dynamics, will really lead to better policies, better responses, a more granular, nuanced understanding of, in our case, today we said that, for instance, the impact of anti-smuggling on a livelihood at local level, unintended consequences of a certain approach based on not nuanced and complex enough understanding could lead to adverse impact, and sometimes to the opposite result of what was intended in the first place. And so we think that, yeah, an investment on data collection, research, analysis should be an important part of policy making, and on in this case, linking back to the issue in Global Europe of an overall approach of European Union toward neighbors and then toward external dimension in a way. Michelle.
Yes, thanks. I actually could maybe tie in the answer with this to maybe addressing the question that Paula Hofmeyer has about the facilitation directive and making it worse. Because I think it's two questions, kind of how do you mobilize, how do you produce all this evidence? And then if you open it all up, is it going to make it all worse? And I wanted to just maybe highlight the Rhizoma project, because that's the one where we were working together with SEPS, with Migration Policy Group, and with other actors. And in a sense, over a multi-annual process, I think it might have been 2 or 3 years, we systematically monitored the cases of people who had been criminalized. So we kind of gave it a new level. Some of our organizations had been doing that prior to the project, so we did it a bit more systematically. We gathered this evidence, and that's why we were saying we have 171 cases during that 4-year period that we looked at, but it's most likely an undercount because it's still not really the true picture of the situation. But we do have a really good snapshot. And at the same time that we were doing that, we were gathering the lawyers of most of these cases. And that's what was very interesting, because we had long discussions with them about Paula Hoffmeyer's question. Should we open up this directive? What should we aim for at the EU level? What would be feasible at the EU level? And many of the lawyers actually did say new legal clarification, because this is what they think the judges most likely will relate to more, is a new legal guidance. They may use guidelines if they are adopted or issued by the European Commission, but the legal definition for them is more critical. And so in the meantime, we have guidance, but even the guidance that we have isn't as broad as it most likely should be, because it doesn't address the whole realm of situations on the ground. So it still doesn't really help us. So I think in general, the question that Paula is asking is the one that we at PICUM have been asking for our whole existence. Should we talk about undocumented migrants? Should we highlight their human rights? Will this make it worse? Will countries actually, because by talking about them, do you open up cans of worms everywhere? And we've actually seen that the cans of worms are there anyway. So if we open it up, and if we have a broader coalition and we have more evidence and more data, we most likely can have a bigger impact. And it usually is a much more positive impact, even despite, this whole context. And just one example, during this pandemic now, in the past couple of months, we've monitored with MPICUM that 7 countries have explicitly said that undocumented migrants will be included in their COVID vaccine strategies. Belgium is one of them. But they've explicitly have it in their policies, and they said that they won't be turned away for getting the COVID vaccine. So it's just one recent example, but we would say that by not talking about it, by kind of not shedding too much light, it's also easier to ignore the problem.
Thank you, Michelle. And Roxane, could you add on that, in your view, would the reopening facilitation directive could lead to potentially more criminalization of those acting in solidarity and of migrants?
Well, I think what Michelle just explained really summarized this issue. I think it's all about legal clarification. If you make it crystal clear from a legal perspective, and if you really look at the narrative that is presented at the European level, namely for profit and a link with organized crime, and we're not denying that it exists, and if it exists, that sort of behavior should be criminalized. But the thing is, it has to be made much more clear in the legal framework for the member states and for judges in the different member states who is a smuggler, into what circumstances, etc. And for now, what we see that it's sometimes it's not clear. So there is always the risk, I suppose, but I think we can really gain from reopening the debate to have a clearer legal framework, which is also in line with the narrative.
And the very last question about the role of diaspora communities. If Keira would like to take it up, or Roberto. Keira?
Yeah. So in the case of irregular migrants in Algeria, diaspora provides information and financial support for people who want or are aspiring to migrate to Europe. This is the majority of the role of diaspora in these journeys. So,
and Roberto, you have something to add?
We have been conducting together with Reach, Impact Reach, some research on the role of diaspora. We have been conducting two studies, one in the role of diaspora based on interviews with refugees and migrants in Sicily, in Italy, another one in a country of region of origin, Kais, Mali. The result a bit mixed. To a certain extent, it seems that the role of diaspora is sometimes in irregular migration decision making, which includes smuggling, is sometimes a bit overstated. And then again, sorry to keep going back to the same, but you need to have a granular nuanced understanding. It seems that within diaspora, there are some sources that are trusted, some others that are not. Within diaspora, some sources are, the moment they say you shouldn't do it, it's dangerous, they are a gatekeeper. They don't want us to go because they are thriving and then achieving their life objective in destination country, so they don't want others to come. And so those people are generally not heard. Within those larger group, there are some that are trusted. So when they are the ones saying you should not come, and then smuggling is dangerous, don't use smugglers, then they are trusted because they are considered as trustworthy. So packaging diaspora, if it was a monolithic group, as much as dangerous as packaging smuggling, as it was a monolithic group, and nuance and then better understanding are needed.
Thank you, Roberto. And with this, maybe for the final comment, because I see Gabriela has been noting down something. Would you like to add some final thoughts?
Really just, I guess, going back to what we were saying, to think more critically about the way we think, again, how often we talk about networks, the way we have come to we have gotten so used to talk about organized crime. And as Michelle said, this virtual absence of engagement with the notion of primarily gender and race, but very much also class. And because the focus on third countries has also led us to forget that smuggling facilitation also occurs within Europe. And if we look at it, again, using the lens of class, we're going to see a very clear indicator, as we see in third countries, as Keira also highlighted. We are looking at people who have experience or who have long histories of discrimination, marginalization, and racial discrimination, being the ones who are involved. So being able to incorporate all of these aspects, and not only, again, to focus on all of these structures that have many times been challenged and questioned themselves for their validity. And here I'm talking again about organized crime and network. When we take a closer look at them through these lenses, we are going to be able to see precisely who is more likely to be criminalized, as we have discussed today. This is not only the so-called big fish that we should not be talking about, either big fish or little fish, but again, it's poor people, because we increasingly see how the facilitation of smuggling is many times a crime of the poor and for the poor.
Thank you, Gabriela. And I guess with this, we can finish this debate. And first of all, thanks a lot for our academic panelists. So Gabriela Sanchez, Eugenia Kusumano, Roxana De Masol, Keira Arusha, and as well for our civil society discussants, Roberto Farin, Michelle Lavoie, who have this wealth of evidence that we will make sure will make into the hands of European Commission colleagues, DG Home, and also for the rest of you, public consultation is open until Friday, so we hope some insights could be also utilized by the rest of the colleagues in their respective submissions. And this is not the end of the discussion. We would be very much interested to have another conversation once the new EU action plan against migrant smuggling is announced, together with you, to take account and to see what has been actually taken on board. And just as a very last point, I would like to announce that also Euromesco colleagues are organizing another event on the same subject. Beyond networks, militias and tribes, rethinking EU's counter-smuggling policy and response, which will happen on 18th of May. So next week, and I think my colleague Andrew will share this in discussion. So once again, thank you for SEPS colleagues, Miriam Mir, Andrew, Falone Chunluk, Xavier Hadidi, and communications colleagues who have spread the word, and also for our attendees who have been very patiently listening to that. Even many of them also could have been perfectly fit here for the panel to share their insights and comments. So we very much look for the subsequent discussions on this very important and topical issue. So thank you once again, and have a nice beginning of the week. So ciao, and see you on the upcoming editions.
Ciao,
ciao.
Thank you.